Hello, welcome. I just like to start the session. It's my pleasure to introduce today's panel. Just one split second. And sorry, I'm double clicking. Okay, now we're good. So I'd like to introduce both today's panel and CoLab. Session's called Introducing CoLab, the Evolution of U.S.-Canada International Collaboration on Drug Safety and Effectiveness. My name is Chris Fignon from McGill University and a member of the CNODES Steering Committee, and it's my pleasure to be moderating today's session. It's an interesting session that's going to have Melissa Catman from Health Canada, David Money from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, Judy Merrow from Harvard and Sentinel, and Terry Ahulia from CADTH. And before we begin, just our disclosures, if I get this right, are shown here on the slide. And with that, I'd like to introduce Melissa to start off today's session.
Great, thank you very much. Oh, just give me one moment to load this up. Doesn't seem to be. This doesn't seem to be.
Oh,
there we go.
I, for one, would like to thank Melissa for working out the bug of the system for us all.
You're welcome. Okay. Okay, let's get started now. Thank you very much for the introduction, Chris. So again, my name is Melissa Catman. I am here from Health Canada's Marketed Health Products Directorate, and I'm going to give you Health Canada's perspective on these collaborations. So I have a really brief overview here of the different topics that I'm going to go through, but for the interest of time, I'm going to get right into the content, starting with DSEN. So back in 2019, the Drug Safety and Effectiveness Network was established between Health Canada and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. So the purpose of this was really to bring together a number of academic teams who could address evidence gaps in post-market safety for decision makers. So based on this, we had 4 research teams over time who answered these research questions through queries for Health Canada. Over the years, we had about 100 research queries between 2009 and 2022. Now, although we found that DSEN was very effective, a 2019 evaluation of the DSEN program found that there was opportunities to potentially be a bit more responsive through a different hosted model. And so this is where, after a committee came together to kind of look at all the strengths and limitations of the program itself, it led to the creation of a CADTH's post-market drug evaluation program due to several reasons, including its ongoing work with the federal, provincial, and territorial governments in Canada, ability to support the work through both contracts and grants. So originally under CIHR, it could only support research through grants themselves, and also because of the integration with the pharmaceutical system itself. And so I know that Terry will speak a bit more about the PMDE program later. So this brings us to CNODES and their FDA Sentinel Common Data Model. So CNODES, or the Canadian Network for Observational Drug Effect Studies, is a research team that was previously part of DSEN, and it is now one of the core network partners under PMDE CoLab. So it is a research network made up of over 100 scientists with various areas of expertise. And what happened here was that CNODES adapted the FDA Sentinel Common Data Model for use in Canada. So I'm not going to speak too much about the specific details of Sentinel. I'll leave that to both David and to Judy. But this was really a way to see how we could have kind of a similar system in Canada. So this led to a pilot project that was originally conducted through a DSEN query that consisted of 3 demonstration studies And the purpose of these was really to ensure data quality and to look at limitations in the Canadian context. So it's a bit of an overview. This CNODES CDM has a variety of data sources and centers that are involved. So core data sources include things like prescription drug claims, hospital discharge abstracts, excuse me. And there's supplementary information. So for example, things such as some lab test results, as well as things like health survey information. So each center under the CDM maintains its own data, but this really permits coordinated and controlled access for network purposes. So based on the standardized structure that they have, this really allows the different data centers to execute common computer programs against their own local data to give standardized output tables, which can then be pooled to give aggregated kind of multi-center results. And so if you look here, this is a schematic of the CDM functions themselves. But really the purpose of this is to provide rapid analyses of things like prescription medication use, patient characteristics, indications, clinical outcomes, and health service use. So all of the tables are regularly updated and reusable, and it really leads to a shorter time frame in conducting this research by conducting queries against multiple data centers. I should note that there are a few data that are missing from the tables, namely drugs dispensed in hospitals, laboratory test results outside of COVID-19, and things like vaccines and a few infused chemotherapies. Now, why is this important? So again, both David and Judy will speak to this a little bit more, but through collaborations, through the Sentinel Common Data Model in the US and the CNODES Common Data Model in Canada, we can kind of address some of the gaps amongst both different countries, as well as certain kind of limitations that are inherent to both of our jurisdictions. So one quick thing that I'll point out here is, as an example, we all recognize the United States is much bigger than Canada, but in Canada, we have the advantage of having greater follow-up per patients. And so there's just some examples kind of in the schematics here, looking at patients in the US Sentinel system and looking at patients with drug coverage in the province of Manitoba in Canada. So we have leveraged the CDM to support several Health Canada activities. So I mentioned those demonstration projects early on. Those are listed here. I'm not going to focus on those, but what I would like to focus on today is two studies that we have conducted through ICMRA, which is the International Coalition of Medicine's Regulatory Authorities. So we came together during COVID-19 with regulatory partners to see what could we do in the real world evidence space. So I'll highlight two of these projects very briefly. So the first is a project looking at the natural history of coagulopathy in COVID-19 patients. So this was led by the US FDA, and the purpose was really to look at the risk of both arterial and venous thrombotic events within 90 days of COVID-19 diagnosis in both the ambulatory and hospital setting, and to also look at heterogeneity amongst countries. So this was a truly collaborative study between FDA Sentinel, EMA, University of Oxford, and CNODES Health Canada. And in that sense, it was collaborative because we had a common protocol, we had a common statistical analysis plan. So it was really executed together amongst the countries. So this is kind of an overview of the different study populations that were included, as well as the number of patients that we had both in the ambulatory and the hospital settings. Now, unfortunately, today I'm not going to provide you with an overview of the results because the manuscript is currently in preparation, but I did really want to flag this just because it is a really good demonstration of how we had a truly collaborative effort. Now, the second one is the systemic corticosteroid treatment in COVID-19 patients. This was also through ICMRA. It was led by the EMA. So this was coming out of the UK-based recovery study and trying to fill some of the gaps in the information that we had based on that study. And Catherine had alluded to that a little bit this morning in the town hall panel session. So the primary objective was to look at the utilization of corticosteroids in two settings, both hospitalized and ambulatory settings within 90 days of COVID-19 diagnosis. Now, for this study, it was a collaborative study in the sense that we all got together to talk about things such as the protocol, but we each conducted the research separately just based on certain, strengths and limitations in our own systems. So for example, the EMA looked at both hospitalized and ambulatory patients. FDA looked at ambulatory only. Health Canada looked at ambulatory and also added in long-term care. There was a number of secondary objectives, and I won't go through each one, but really, again, it was kind of to show that we picked different components that would work for each regulator in conducting this research. Now, in terms of US FDA, so they published the results back in 2022 in JAMA, and with the Health Canada CNODES research, what we did was permission was granted by FDA Sentinel to share the code with CNODES. And what they did was they utilized that code to run in the CNODES CDM. And they also added on long-term care to kind of add a different perspective to this specific study. And so you'll see here some of the results of corticosteroid use and dispensing over time. So in the Sentinel system, you'll see, for example, use increased from 2.2% in April 2020 to 21.1% in August 2021, for example, in Medicare. You'll see that there was much less dispensing in Canada, and although it increased over time, it never quite hit the same points as it did in the US. So differences between both systems and prescribing practices. So in terms of the overall findings, again, we found that it was very limited in terms of corticosteroid use in Canada. Recipients in Canada were generally older, more likely to reside in long-term care. They had a higher prevalence of comorbidities. And so these were people who were overall more likely to use health services than patients in other settings. We also found, again, that treatment rates were significantly lower than observed in the US. So for example, in the US, in January 2021, about 12% of the population was using it in the general adult population and 19% amongst senior Medicaid beneficiaries. Now, with this research, originally the CNODES team had also planned to do a comparative study, but what they found was because usage was so low within Canada, they would have needed a longer accrual period, but this was not possible because we didn't have enough patients to get that significant number of exposed patients. So at least from the Canadian perspective, it really was comforting in the sense that we showed that use was not, use was more limited in Canada, which kind of worked with the original concerns that were given based on the recovery trial in patients who were not utilizing oxygen for treatment of COVID-19 or support during treatment of COVID-19. So this was really just kind of a very quick overview of some of the research that we've done. So I will say that we have used the CNODES CDM through Health Canada to answer research questions in the past, but we think there's a more strategic way to use it moving forward. And so this could also be supported through things like capacity building and initiating new research queries, even in different areas. So for example, potentially in the pregnancy space. We saw that collaborative studies through ICMRA were very successful in terms of our collaborations with the FDA and the EMA. And so this is an area that we want to continue to explore in terms of enhanced collaboration and looking at, are there ways where we can perhaps routinely collaborate to answer research questions that are of common interest to regulators such as FDA or other regulators in the future. So with that, I will end my presentation. And thank you very much.
Oh, very nice. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Money, and I'm here to present the counterpart to Melissa's presentation about the FDA perspective on the international collaborations. For this presentation, I'll just do a quick overview, high level for Sentinel. Judy Merrill will pick that up for me. And then a quick example study of a utilization study of valsartan containing nitrosamine impurities. That was an example of an international collaboration across 4 countries, undertaken under pretty tight timelines for some fairly high-level concerns about this issue. So the US and Canada have collaborated in a number of occasions in the past. Here you'll see a couple examples. I'll be presenting the top and right example today when I get to that. So Sentinel's system is, I assume many of you are familiar with it, but Sentinel is a distributed network of data partners that are formed for the purposes of conducting post-marketing drug safety research. The system was formed in response to legislation for the Food and Drug Amendments Act of 2007, otherwise known as FDA, and it utilizes a common data model and predefined reusable code to allow us to do our work. A bit more about the common data model. As the landscape of drug safety is always changing and always moving, so too must the model be flexible for the needs of the regulators. So while access to EHR registry and survey data is available in Sentinel and increases capability, the bulk of the data is in the claims space. This creates both advantages and limitations. Sentinel's underlying structure allows for the development of definitions, operational definitions that are pulled from the CDM data elements on a per study basis. But we're also able to reuse that code and reuse those definitions in the future to allow more efficient use of the system. You'll see a little bit later from Judy Merrow's presentation, but Sentinel works very closely with the data partners to populate these data tables. They leverage local knowledge and expertise to allow always available quality assured data for analysis, pretty much at the drop of a hat. So here's just a quick overview of the common data model. Individual data elements are organized by data type or domain and linked across by patient IDs. The Sentinel Operations Center coordinates the network of all the Sentinel data partners and leads the development of this model. It's a standardized structure that allows the partners to quickly execute distributed programs on their own local data and then have the results collated and sent to the FDA at the Sentinel Operations Center. If we were to follow an example patient through the healthcare system here, we'll take patient 1 on the top here. We see they have some basic demographic information and enrollment data. In this case, it's a somewhat atypical 14 years of total enrollment. The patient had 2 inpatient visits, an encounter table at the top right. Inpatient visits were for major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety. But in May 2006, she gave birth to a baby boy, as seen in the encounter and procedure tables. This information was then captured by the mother-infant linkage tables, which allows us to then follow both the infant and the mother forward over time for safety outcomes. So as Melissa mentioned, with some more specific numbers here, Sentinel is very large, and that's one of its advantages. It lets us look at rare outcomes in very distinct populations to do our work. In 2020, we had something like 75 million lives that were covered in the system. But bigger is not, of course, always better. As Melissa showed with that huge bar with 20 years of follow-up, CNODES has some distinct advantages in that area. In the Sentinel system, you'll see that approximately 26% of patients have 5 years or more of follow-up, and that does limit us somewhat towards more acute outcomes quite often, depending on the population and the exposure you're looking at. But the systems are complementary in other ways besides just the length of follow-up. So an example of this international collaboration I was speaking about, in 2018, the US and other international agencies identified impurities in an angiotensin receptor blocker called valsartan. That's an ARB, and issued recall notices pulling it off the market. Because this was a rapidly evolving healthcare crisis emergency. There was an international collaboration undertaken to help understand better the reaction to the recalls, how the physicians and patients responded to it, but also to contextualize and put into view the potential patient exposure and therefore the potential risk to these products with nitrosamine impurities. Given the focus of today's presentations, I'll be focusing just on the US and Canadian data here. So to estimate the proportion of, the study was undertaken with the goal of estimating the proportion of ARB-containing products with impurities used over time in these 4 countries, and then to estimate the proportion of patients who switched between products and also to other antihypertensives such as ACE inhibitors and calcium channel blockers. In the US and Canada, products manufactured with a pharmaceutical ingredient found to contain the impurity were identified, mapped to the ANDA numbers or the NDA numbers, and then back to the NDCs. These were all classified as recalled products, and if you weren't recalled, you were a non-recalled product and classed as such. So the next few slides present the data at a high level that we retrieved or came up with at the end of the day. Note that the panel, before someone calls me out on it, the x-axis is different to help show the differences between the US and Canadian data. We see that both countries at the time of the recall notice, there was this very rapid change in the number of episodes of valsartan in the systems, followed later by drops in losartan and olmesartan. But we also see some pretty significant differences between the countries. While candesartan and losartan were the most common ARBs in Canada, in the US, it was losartan and valsartan. Between 2012 and 2018, both impure and recalled valsartan dominated in the US and Canadian markets. By 2019, all of the contaminated products had been removed from the market, and then there was a slow uptake afterwards in 2020 and 2021, which you can see in that little U-shaped blue line there. So here's a closer look at the switching from one ARB to another ARB per 1,000 episodes. We see this very distinct spike indicating this rapid around the recall time switching off of valsartan. And you can see down at the other ARBs that temporally they're very similar, but they differ in extent due to the utilization within each country. Looking a little bit more broadly at the switching trends, we look at the patterns of valsartan switching, but also switching to other products. Looking at that post-recall spike, we see that even though there was availability of non-impure valsartan on the market, patients tended not to switch to that, and they switched to other ARB products. The product of choice turned out to be, not surprisingly, the most commonly other ARB in each country. That was candesartan in Canada and losartan in the US. We do, however, see some movement towards use of products in other classes with small increases in ACE inhibitors and calcium channel blockers. Based on the maximum concentrations of nitrosamine impurities that were identified in these products, and then the maximum duration of exposure of 1 year, as estimated from the analyses done here. The investigators estimated a lifetime exposure of 0.0006 to 0.01 micrograms per day from the contaminated valsartan products. These numbers are at least 150-fold lower than the threshold of 1.5 micrograms per day that was determined for toxicological concern for mutagenic impurities in drug substances. So this 1.5 micrograms per day is roughly a 1 in 100,000 increase in risk over a patient's lifetime. Beyond this, though, I'd like to call out the differences in the follow-up that you see in the bottom line for non-recalled branded. In the US, we had approximately 2.6 million episodes of these products with a duration of use of around 167 days. While in Canada, which was smaller, 157,000 episodes, had much longer duration of use of 319 days. Not shown here, but if you're desperately interested, you can go back to those articles I showed earlier. The US also had substantially more patients with histories of hyperlipidemia, hypertension, and renal disorders. And this would be one example of how we could leverage these international collaborations to look at specific populations and try and inform the risk in each country. So in summary, losartan, the study revealed that losartan was the most common ARB in the US, while candesartan in Canada. The mean duration use was much longer in Canada. Given that the low levels of nitrosamine of the recalled products and the duration of use, increased cancer risks were unlikely in these populations. But this isn't kind of in the bigger picture, right? This is an example of how regulators can leverage a common data model and common programming to rapidly execute complementary studies to inform both of their countries' safety concerns on drug safety. And this can also provide a more complete view of drug safety in the US and in other countries that collaborate. I would absolutely be remiss to not put up this slide about the large number of people that were involved. This was a very large lift across all of the groups, including in some countries converting to the CDM for the very first time. This was a difficult undertaking and it required a lot of effort from all of these folks, but we hope that this effort will help to pave the way towards future collaborations internationally. So, thank you very much.
I always have to be the one to lower the microphone throughout the day. So I'll put it in presentation mode. So the idea behind this part of the talk was to have given you perspective from both of the different regulators and then talk about the practical elements of how we actually make this happen and what is required in order to do that. And so we're very lucky to have the support of both the regulators. They meet routinely, independently of anything that they do for Sentinel or CNODES. They're able to have discussions routinely about what their needs are, about what the safety questions of interest are, and to think about how to, again, leverage these strengths. And then they come to us to ask us to go ahead and execute them. And so both the CNODES side, who work for essentially the Canadian federal authorities, and then us who work for the US federal authorities, we take our instruction based on the concerns that they have and try our best to utilize the vast data that we have available in the Common Data Model in order to answer those questions. So there are a couple of slides here that you've seen before in the previous presentations, but I'm going to emphasize one particular point on each of them. And the point I want to emphasize on this one is this concept at the bottom about how closely we have to work with each of these sites in order to understand their data and how important it is to have local expertise in each of these places to understand how that data are being collected and how then we can use them. And so one of the things that, is, a learning experience as I have worked more and more with Chris and with Robert and with Mike Patterson, who is not here with us, but is a really critical person in CNODES, is how much there are differences province by province in Canada. And all of these are provincial databases. And so they all have their own idiosyncrasies and regulations. And you have to start to know each of these partners in order to be able to work with them to understand how they are capturing their data, but then also how it can be utilized and what are the special regulatory concerns that they have and the compliance concerns they have within each of their provincial governments, in addition to any federal regulations. So one of the key things here is that all of this is made possible by the fact that I can, send an email and talk to these folks basically whenever I need to. And that close collaboration is what makes this whole thing possible, in that we can reach out and we have people with the local expertise that can help us to understand how this works. So in this slide, I just have a couple of notations about where the differences mainly are. So one of the advantages, again, of the US-Canada relationship, what I think of as the North American the data network, is that the populations are largely similar, although they have specific differences. From a perspective of answering a question in these data, the main coding things that we have to be aware of is how drugs are captured in the United States using national drug codes, and how they're captured in Canada using drug information numbers, and how those can correlate to each other, and how we're making sure that we're actually measuring the same thing. The other big difference is that in Canada, they use a diagnostic coding system that is a slight modification of what is used in the US. So we always have to do a double check that when we're looking at these outcomes, that in fact how they're coded works in both of those systems. And so those are the very specific things that we have to look for when we're executing a common query against all of these different sites, as they're going to run those locally and then send aggregated summary results back to us. So this is a science slide you've probably seen before. This is just an emphasis on the fact, and frankly, the earlier workshops and symposia really set us up for today if people attended the privacy preserving real world data workshop earlier, because there was a lot of talk about how everything is maintained locally, and then summarized data sets come back to the coordinating centers. That's how we work within the Sentinel Operations Center, and that's how CNODES works as well. And so here I have highlighted on the screen the different provinces that actually maintain their data in the data model in like a blue bold, and how we work with those folks. So one of the first things that we do when we've decided to engage in an international collaboration is we want to make sure we refresh the data. And once we refresh the data, the first thing we do is our standard quality assurance checks. And so we've sort of instituted a process to be able to do this seamlessly across both the United States sites and the Canadian sites. So we have a common quality assurance package that is able to not only look at, again, the differences here, the national drug codes in the US, the drug information numbers in Canada. It goes out to each of the coordinating centers, and then each of the coordinating centers here, the US-based one and the Canadian one, send it out to each of their sites. And then those sites all execute that package, so SAS program, and then they send it back to the coordinating centers to review, to ensure that the data are fit for purpose and able to be used by regulators. So again, we have a very high standard of what we allow to be used in regulatory decision-making. And so everything has to pass, and we have actually fail criteria, and we have to make sure that everything goes through and gets checked. And so this is a process that's executed in each site that's going to be contributing, and it's done every time there needs to be a data refresh when new data has been introduced and it hasn't been checked previously. So this is a standard graphic that we have on the website explaining this process. One of the things that I think I've appreciated more is how much we spend time talking with folks about how to interpret their quality assurance data sets that come back to them. So when we send this package and program out, there are basically somewhere between 20 and 30 data sets that are created for each individual site to look through their data and to understand more about that data, and what its outliers are and what the frequency distributions are. And so we talk with folks about that. But one of the interesting things is, because those data sets contain complete distributions and oftentimes small cell counts, they actually can't be shared. So we discuss them together, but we actually don't see our other sort of, sister sites, if you would, data sets. We work with them and talk through the data sets and talk about how to interpret them, but the data still stay local. And so we use that local expertise in order to be able to leverage these data. So once we've done a quality assurance process, now we're actually ready to sort of put together a regulatory query. And so here, when we decide that a query is being done, so both Dave and Melissa gave examples of particular queries where there was a decision to go ahead and do a study. And so similarly here, essentially deciding on what study design and what regulatory permissions are needed requires both of the regulatory agencies, both in the US and Canada, and then both of the coordinating centers to come together and talk about if given a request, we would like to study, this drug and this outcome, for example, how we're going to do that, how we're going to set it up, and then what regulatory permissions are needed to do that. So this is where, again, understanding the local, the customs and the expertise is really important. So people may be aware that in the United States, the FDA operates under what is called public health surveillance. So IRBs are not required for any of the queries that FDA is able to execute. That is not common and not something that can be replicated in Canada, for example. And so we have different processes we have to go through for each of these sites in order to be able to just start the query and start running. And then we put together a package, again, thinking very carefully about how to operationalize these definitions, both in the United States and Canada, talking closely about what they mean and ensuring that we are actually measuring the same thing. And then we put together that common package, which has all of the codes for both of the jurisdictions in there. We, at the different coordinating centers, we will go ahead and send out those packages to each of the individual sites. They will run those, and then each of those sites will investigate their particular data-specific results to understand what they can do with it. And now this is the part where it gets very particular and tricky, and this is our best practices and lessons learned after having done this several times. So we have a set of summary results, but inevitably in those summary results, we end up having small cells. And so one thing that's true about all of these different jurisdictions is that they all have different rules about what constitutes a small cell and whether or not that data can be combined. So we've worked through with each of these sites how to review their data together for the heterogeneity of it. And so one of the big considerations is, should we combine the data or not? And so when we look through these data, we have a sort of a joint review process to look together and decide whether the data can be combined. If it can be, we may have to combine via meta-analysis, especially if there are small cells in various jurisdictions. But if there aren't, there is code that we have that can combine them all into one pooled summary data set and then have a regression model or something of that nature run against that. We have not had that experience yet because we've never avoided the small cells, frankly. So I'm hoping for the day when that happens, but considering the rarity of events that are sometimes looked for by the regulatory agencies, I'm not holding out hope that it will ever happen. But the bottom line is we go through this very specific process in order to be able to run these analyses. So a couple of our lessons learned, we want to be, so this is just an example from the study that Dave talked about, where we want to be transparent about the heterogeneity that exists within these data. So we recommend always thinking about presenting country-specific information in addition to whether or not we decide to combine that data. And then we are hoping to be very transparent about all the work that we do. And so all of these queries eventually make it to having the programs published online. So folks that have data in the Common Data Model, if they have them, they could run the same query in their own set, whether that be data that is Canadian data or is American data. And so some just collaboration takeaways. I hope I have left you with the thought that the context and the local expertise really matters here. We want to leverage that subject matter expertise in each jurisdiction to make sure that we are doing our due diligence with measurement. We want to embrace the heterogeneity that naturally exists across the US and Canada and take advantage of that. But we want to eliminate any artifacts that could happen from different programming approaches or other things. And we take special care to understand whether we ought to combine data or not. There's a deliberate decision-making process that goes into that for each of these queries. And then finally, that regulatory compliance rules are complicated, and so when we think about how to do this, we get better at it each time. And I think that it's one of those things that with practice will just continue to improve. And so I'm hoping that we will continue to be faster and faster as we learn which gates we have to go through in order to be able to do this work routinely. And with that, I will turn it over to Carrie to introduce CoLab.
We could just do it, right?
Thanks, Chris. So good afternoon, everyone. Congrats on making it to almost 4:30. I know these are long days and there's a lot of information being thrown at you. I'm really happy and lucky to be anchoring this great panel to introduce something that's I think pretty special and really exciting. I usually start with a really provocative RWED joke, but I will not because of time. Unfortunately, we don't have no time, so unfortunately, we'll have to save that for another time. But we'll get into CoLab and we were set up really well today with Mel and Judy and David around talking about the great collaboration that's been in place already. The CNODES team has been working with FDA Sentinel to do some great projects, and along the way, things have changed. The environment changes, CNODES and its funding model has changes, and the needs of both the US and Canada has changed. I think the other thing that's changed is our willingness to use real-world data and real-world evidence, and the willingness to dissolve our borders in a lot of ways and work more closely across the FDA, Health Canada, CADTH, and Sentinel. I think it's been great. So we're gonna highlight the creation of this new program called CoLab, and then we're gonna talk a little bit about the future of how we can continue these great collaborations to answer these clearly mutually beneficial problems that are in front of us. Okay, so as we heard before, DSEN was in existence, so the Drug Safety Effectiveness Network in Canada, and this was a network that was created in 2009 to answer a simple question. The decision makers have questions and they need data. And how do we get that data? And so we wanted to create this network across our country, a distributed network that would answer some of these questions through data. So that was in place, and in the early days, there's clearly a lot of headaches in setting up something like that, but they were successful in creating this network and trying to answer these queries. But as Melissa had highlighted, there were some pains and barriers with an ambitious project like that, and the landscape has continually changed. So that brings us to 2021. In 2020, the decision was made to transition this DSEN network idea to CADTH under a new premise. And so this is where we decided to architect something completely new with the same intent and objective, that objective of getting evidence for senior decision makers. And who's a decision maker? Who am I talking about? So these are people in our country, in Canada, that manage our drug formularies, deciding which medicines you have access to. And so they need to make these decisions, we hopefully think, based on evidence that they have in hand. It's scary to find out sometimes they don't always have access to that information, or they don't have the capacity or ability to get the data they require to make some of those informed decisions. So we put a team together in place to create the post-market drug evaluation program at CADTH. We then also went to set up a new DSEN, which we called CoLab, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. And the goal was to achieve the original mission, but also to continue to innovate and collaborate with those that are already in the system. So I know this is probably not a lot of concern to you, but I wanted to highlight a couple of things that were really guiding lights for us as those that sit within CADTH, and that was to follow our strategic pillars at CADTH. So you can see the three pillars here: anticipate, innovate, and transform. So I really wanted to hone in on the fact that our team, the PMDE CoLab team, one of our guiding lights is really innovation, and the second being right here, partnership or collaboration. So these are some of the guiding principles of CADTH as an organization, and we obviously like to emulate and follow those and stay aligned. So again, innovation, partnership, these are really key important deals for us. So we went ahead to create this new post-market drug evaluation program and this new network called CoLab. So what were our objectives? What are we trying to do? So the first off was to answer those decision maker-led questions. These are questions that they need answered. How do we answer those? The second was to look at post-market drugs that have gone through review, that are currently in market and are currently available to patients. The second was we want to use our network to answer these questions. And then last, we wanted to successfully launch the program, which we did in 2021, and our network was launched in 2022. So I'm going to show this fairly simple figure, but I think it's simple but eloquent because it highlights for a lot of people the whole drug review process or a drug review life cycle. I think a lot of us are really well versed in the idea of a clinical trial and all the great work that happens in advance of something entering market. And then there's the review by the regulator or HTA bodies, and then it finally enters market. And a lot of times the story stops there unless we're talking about pharmacovigilance or safety flags. So I'm just going to highlight some of the key spots here. So you can see right, no, you can't see there. We have a pre-market space. And in that space at CADTH, this is an opportunity where we engage with sponsors or manufacturers, and they can come ask questions related to the evidence package they're going to be submitting to the regulator or to the HTA body. This is a point at which we can say RWE would be valuable here, and this is how, and they could ask us questions around what would you require, what would be acceptable, things of that nature. Finally, once the evidence packages are put together and they've completed their clinical trials, it will go to our CADTH reimbursement review program, where you get a recommendation of list or do not list, much like you would see in other countries. And typically, if it's a list, it enters market. Now, the whole tail end of that process is post-market drug evaluation. In simple English, that means patients are taking this medicine. And now, how is that medicine acting in the real world? Is it doing what it's supposed to do? Are there any safety concerns that we didn't see in the clinical trial? Are we still making the right decision years down the road based on our initial decision? So that is the post-market space. So we wanted to create a new network we called CoLab. We felt ourselves being very clever. This is a collaboration, and it's multiple labs across our country. We've got some cool colors. And this is where it's situated within the organization. So CADTH is the HTA body in Canada alongside INES. Then we have our post-market drug evaluation program. And within that program is where we have CoLab, the network. Now, this is a geographical schematic that shows the different sites and teams across the country. And you see, we're fairly fortunate. We have pretty good geographical representation. This can further get subdivided into specific subsites that are involved within this network. But we're really great to have people all the way from east all the way to west. So what are some of the features of the network? First off is we wanted to bridge the gap between those that are asking the questions and the doers, the researchers. This is kind of a systemic problem that we've had for many years, is how do you make that connection? Researchers sometimes speak a different language than health policymakers, and that can become a challenge. A lot of times researchers have different guiding principles, and policymakers are like, I need this information now. Forget about your double checking and all your forest plots. Just give me an answer. And so there's a bit of a problem there. So how do you bridge that gap? And that's where CADTH comes in, because CADTH regularly engages with the FPTs, which stands for the Federal Provincial Territorial Partners. And they're really our customers. They're the ones that we're trying to serve. How do we help them have the evidence they require to make the appropriate decisions? And so we become that translator, that connection hub, that coordinating hub. The second, and it's not really that important for you, but in terms of how we fund the teams that are part of this network, we have a mix of granting and contracting. And why does that matter? Well, grants, typically those in the academic space know you get a chunk of money to do the work that you've outlined, and off you go. In a model like this, we wanted something that allows us to adapt and pivot based on the needs of the environment. You can't always grant everybody, so it's nice to have a pool of contractors that you can bring aboard depending on what the question is. COVID didn't exist 3 years ago. If we had granted teams that were not vested in that space, we would be unable to do that type of work. So having the ability to change based on the environment. I just want to skip down a couple things here, but one, KM and KT, knowledge mobilization, considering the fact that two groups speak different languages, you need to make sure they're understanding the message. So having really great dissemination pieces and translating this into simple English that the decision maker can understand. And then the second is around partnerships and collaborations. This is probably why we're here today. We're talking about how can we learn from those that are already in the space that have done this work in the past. And if you look internationally, you're surprised by how many great groups are out there, FDA Sentinel included. We have NCEP in Europe and other groups doing really great work that you can lean on, learn from, and partner with. I'm just going to really quickly flash up the teams that make up our CoLab network. Clearly, I'm highlighting CNODES here today because of the content and because they drive and possess the CDM model that they built off of Sentinel. Robert Platt, who is the chair of the meeting here at ISBE, is the lead on this group, and we work with the team there to do not only potentially CDM work, but other queries that are coming from decision makers. I do want to highlight the fact that we have different teams that are situated across the country. That's the first thing. So that kind of gives us good coverage. And then the second is their skill set. So not everybody's doing the exact same thing. CNODES clearly is best suited in observational research, but we have other groups that do HTA or health economics, oncology work. And so this allows us to cover a lot of different topic areas. We also have network collaborators, and specialty collaborators. These are the groups that will be contracted and can do different work, again, depending on what the ask is. So let's talk about the use of real world evidence right now in decision making, and how is it going, and how easy is it? So clearly we've had a lot of issues and barriers. And I think if anybody's been around in the area in the last 10 years, you've heard many, many RWE talks on barriers to use and how is this not being used and all the problems and caveats with it. But I think the tide has slowly turned and people are now becoming a little bit more open to using it. And you see this a lot with payers and using it for decision making. So what are some of these barriers, or what are the barriers and issues that still exist? So one is the lack of consensus on guidance or principles. I'm going to get to that in just a sec. Managing uncertainty, the trust and transparency, sharing of risk, and just the access and availability of real world data, real world evidence. So very recently, a multifunctional group led by CADTH's RWE steering committee put out a guidance for reporting real world evidence. And the idea was to start that conversation, to put something ahead where people could see, and whether it's industry, researchers, policymakers, of these are the basic principles that we're saying should be followed as it relates to use of real world evidence. So the objectives here, I've kind of already said, and to really push that transparency and that visibility of, yes, let's use real world evidence, and here's how we think we should do that. Other groups have done the same. I know there's the IMI program and ISPI's put out a statement. FDA has a lot of content on it. There's a lot of groups around the world. So the point is, we're not the first out there. I think we've leaned a lot on what they've said. So there was global alignment, or at least international alignment. And you see that with a lot of the information that's been put out. Okay, so now we're getting into the topic of co-production. So clearly you saw great examples today of several countries collaborating, now FDA Sentinel and Health Canada CNODES collaborating. What does that mean? And how is that something that's a strength and a tool? So there's a lot of fancy terms for it. But the idea is those that are involved throughout the process, like from the question to doing the work to the deliverable, should be involved. You know, the antiquated model is somebody has a question, somebody runs away in a lab, does the work, and you just get this report. I think that is becoming an outdated model on how work should be produced. So the idea is you're linking knowledge generators and the knowledge users. So in simple English, in our scenario here, those that are asking questions versus those that are coordinating versus those that are doing. So in our scenario here, if a decision maker in our country needs to connect with us, then also needs to connect with Health Canada or in the CNODES team. So collaboratively, everybody agrees that this is the question, this is the policy issue, this is the best approach, and this is what we will produce, and this is how it will be used. And the end deliverable will be co-owned by all these individuals so that there's mutual ownership and acceptance of what is generated. It seems like a fairly intuitive thing, but that's not what was happening. It's still not happening in a lot of places. So this is something that we're really pushing is co-production and trying to really have everybody sit around the table to discuss what's going on. There's a fancy definition, which I don't think is important. I think what's important here is that all people that are involved in the project are active. We align the research and the policy issue, and that it gives us an opportunity when you co-produce across, whether it's a country or countries, to increase the data pool and the impact that this research can have. Okay, so I'm looking at the great examples that David and Judy produced today. They talked about sharing data across our two countries, and the information that it provided was much more impactful than the information we would have had individually or just by province. So there's the ability to pool within your own country. There's ability to pool across countries and regions. And as you do that, the significance of what you find has more power. So currently what's in front of us is an opportunity to have a variety of players together. And so who are we talking about? So I'm suggesting here at this figure that we have the HTA bodies in CADTH, we have the regulator in Health Canada or FDA. You'd have CNODES, which is part of our CoLab network. The decision maker would be involved. They're the ones asking and driving the query. And then we'd have FDA Sentinel as a potential partner, or it could be anybody who holds data internationally. And together you generate a pool of co-owned real world evidence that could be used as required. So what is the future? What are we trying to do here? I don't think the idea is novel. Clearly, CNODES and FDA Sentinel have been working for years. I think the utility of what's being produced and the impact is clear. However, like I said before at the top of the talk, is that the landscape has changed, right? So borders are becoming more open. I think what the needs of the decision makers are has changed. The acceptance and availability of real world evidence has changed. and a new network is in existence. So CoLab. And so how do we look forward? What are we trying to accomplish? So first off, yes, CNODES is now part of our CoLab network, which is fantastic. They have the CNODES CDM, which is based off the Sentinel CDM. So those things are already in play, which is great. I think there's an opportunity for us to now leverage this and escalate how often and how well that collaboration is used. This timeliness that the CDM provides is crucial because as you engage with policymakers, you understand that they don't have 9 months to a year to make a policy decision. They need to make it today, tomorrow, within 3 to 6 months. So having a tool that gives you good data, especially if it's bridged across 2 countries, and you can do that quickly, that's a huge deal. Okay, so being able to provide timely information so they can make informed decision is something that is a huge selling point for those who basically fund us and those who we're trying to serve. Today, again, we had great examples. It was said several times. The US has really powerful big data, lots of it, right? But the time horizon is shorter, whereas Canada, we're a cute, smaller country, right? 30 million people only compared to what the States has. But what we have is longevity. We have this long time horizon where you get a really nice picture of data that's going over a long period of time. Put those two together, and that's a fantastic package. You have the best of both worlds. So what are our objectives going forward? So one is we want to continue to show that our 2 countries can work together on a collaborative project with the same goal and mission. We want to continue to produce queries and involve and co-produce these queries with all of those involved. This gives us not only jurisdictional impact, it gives us national impact, but it gives us North American impact. So you have various levels of impact that you can showcase when you work like this. We also want to push the idea of improving the methods. Jude, you can see the amount of work that these guys put into data tables and making sure all countries are on board and triple checking everything. That's something to be commended. And I think we can continue to evolve into creating methods and accepted practices to feed into the guiding principles that CADTH and other countries are trying to put forth. So we're now currently embarking on 3 pilots to start this process. So we have 3 pilots that are now engaged. We've started with our first. The CNODES team is now starting to emulate an FDA completed project. And we're going to show that using the code that they produce, we can do this in a timely fashion. We can try to pool the results and we can look at the impact that it can have. We also want to show this to our decision makers, so our customers, to say, here's something that we can do. We can do it alongside FDA. We could do it alongside other countries that are doing a similar thing. And this will allow us to show the opportunity and the ability to have future co-produced topics that are mutually beneficial. So I think that is a really key point. The COVID examples David provided was a great example of that, where COVID forced our hand. We globally all had the same questions. We all wanted to have the same answers. And so it was a great opportunity or sandbox to say, hey guys, let's play together and get mutually beneficial answers. I think if you apply that to other disease states and other areas, we could apply and do the same thing. I think there are a lot of topics, a lot of questions that are out there that would be best answered if done as in a co-produced fashion. So I will stop, and that's it, my time. Thank you so much.
Perfect. I want to thank our speakers for very interesting perspectives and talk on. We've seen both where we've been, some really good collaborations, between Canada, US Sentinel, and CNODES, and we just heard from Terry about what the future pertains and where we're going. So we've left lots of time for questions, and so there's a mic up front. So I'd like to encourage folks to come ask questions. And while folks are doing that, I guess I'm going to just start with a follow-up comment to something Judy had said, and just where she was talking about the need for local expertise. And I just really want to emphasize that. I think the CDM is nice in that we have this this common data model set up with these programs, but I think as Judy said, just the need for local expertise and understanding the underlying data. So in Canada, health is a provincial jurisdiction, and while the populations are very similar, there's important differences in formulary restrictions and also data capture and structure in the different provinces. So as we're looking, both within Canada and then in international partnerships, I think being able to understand potential sources of heterogeneity, that's important. And, just like the CDM isn't just push button epi, right? It still requires it facilitates it, but it really still requires a lot of thought locally and collaboratively. So I think that's important. So I just like to ask folks, just to introduce themselves with the question, please.
Hey, thanks very much. My name is Andrew Basham. I'm with the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology, Brigham and Harvard Med. My question, really great work. And I guess I'm interested in, I saw in the last presentation, it was CoLab sort of powered by CADTH. I'm wondering about like sort of who's in charge, I guess, if there's an ownership structure. I know that's it's a collaborative thing, obviously. And then I was also wondering about, I know the post-marketing of drugs, evaluation of drugs is important, but I'm wondering if you see opportunities for expanding this into other areas like social inequities and health between countries, and, what the future holds for maybe that kind of cross-country resource. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So CADTH stands for Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health, just for those who don't know, and that's the Canadian HTA body. So yes, CoLab and CoLab is part of, and I would say owned by, the post-market drug evaluation program of CADTH. We're funded by Health Canada to manage and run this program. Now, what we say by collaboration is that all those that are members of the network are part of one unified network. They all have access to the same facilities, and we as CADTH act as a coordination hub. So all queries come through us, and then we help determine the appropriate team within our network to answer the questions. Each teams are granted or funded based on what their needs were and based on the size of their teams and networks, their own sub-networks. And that is how we kind of help determine. And so in terms of what's produced, the output, the deliverables, it's all co-owned. So if a team like CNODES is working on a query and produces the report for us, for our decision maker, they can also use this to publish or to present and to do subsequent work. So that's what we meant by collaborative. We wanted to change the model of it being, you work for us or we can't work with other teams. Multiple teams within our network can actually work together to answer an individual query as well. So that kind of feeds into that CoLab and collaboration. To the second part of your question was, can we look at things outside of just standard post-market drug evaluation? I think that is a dream of ours, and we do have, blue sky a plan. I think our plan first was to launch and see if anybody would even ask us questions and get any queries, and we were really fortunate to get many queries. And other things that we're looking at are ways to get into other spaces of data and looking at working more with industry, looking at working with other partners, even more closely with the regulator. So there are other things we're trying to get into, including social determinants of health. Okay.
I think that everything that Terry said gives a good overview of it. I will say that in terms of, social determinants of health, underrepresented populations are something that we are very interested in, because we know, especially for whether it's Canada, the US, and other countries, there's specific populations for us, Indigenous populations. It's a very difficult population to get access to in terms of data. So that is definitely an area of interest for us as well.
I think just to add to that, in terms of the underserved, there's from a Indigenous and at the population level, but also, as we heard earlier today, rare diseases and a lot of the oncology products where trials aren't feasible and are probably one of the areas that's ripe for real world evidence too. Yes.
My name is Aisha Traore. I'm an epidemiologist with Alexion Pharmaceutical, which is AstraZeneca rare disease. In my line of work, I'm sometimes required to generate evidence, real world evidence across different jurisdictions. And we all know the struggle is real to access the data. I was just wondering if there's any future plan after all your presentation to allow the industry to submit query to get access our report from all these different jurisdictions instead of going on our own and ask every single one of them to get the data. Given you have access to the data now and you can cross-reference all of it, is it possible for us to submit a query in the future?
So I'll take the first stab of that, and maybe you guys can add in. Currently, we're not accepting queries from industry, but we are committed to improving engagement with industry. So we have, and I didn't really get into it today, but we have an advisory committee, a PMDE advisory committee. And on there, we have 2 seats for industry. We've also recently launched an industry task force. We're trying to help figure out ways where we can better engage with the industry. So like you said, industry is a huge producer of and consumer of real-world data. So it seems odd to not have them included in the conversation and not try and find, again, this mutually beneficial output of trying to get evidence to make good decisions to help better patients. So currently my short answer is no, but we love to, continue thinking that way and figure out ways where we can better engage you guys.
And I guess just to add to that, like in CNODES, one of the keys to success in CNODES has been our collaborations with our provincial partners and the provincial data custodians, because it's, the provincial data are owned by the provincial custodians. So we have, data agreements provincially, and, the data are all remaining in the provinces. So while we're accessing it, it's through these agreements, that are in place. There's not just one database sitting at the coordinating center. David.
Hi, my name's David Stock. I actually work at CADTH in the post-market drug evaluation with Terry. A quick question. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. I just thought I might be able to ask, what are the biggest perceived barriers going forward, expanding this collaboration? I guess we can mostly stick to Sentinel and CNODES through CoLab, because that was what most of the presentations were speaking to. So is it things like preemptively foreseeing these data quality issues beforehand better, or finding out more efficient ways to deal with them? Is it finding out ways to improve data resources to sort of try and keep up with the ever expanding common data model data types? So for example, the sort of qualitative patient outcomes data, or some of the other data that Sentinel has more recently started to collect. And just quickly, on the international scale, what about European pharmacovigilance? What about collaborations with NCEP, Darwin EU? Are the biggest issues there translating common data models? I think Darwin EU is going with OMOP. I think there was an adjacent initiative at Sentinel, sort of harmonizing common data models. Is that a big issue for international collaboration? So any comments in those areas?
There's a lot there.
Can you repeat the question, please?
So I think speaking from the regulator and like the international collaboration overall, I think the biggest barriers are just coming together as countries. I think the individual scientists and the individual people looking to make decisions are looking for data, right? And, I'm talking to Melissa, and we're talking to the regulators. We come here and we talk to like other people, and we all have these same common issues. It's getting the governments to work together a little bit and dealing with that infrastructure side. That's kind of, Judy would be able to talk about all the details of data, but for us, it's that legislative, that like interaction between the governments and getting those agreements in place for confidential information and data sharing and all those kind of things. And we do leverage out, our currently standing, pharmacovigilance calls and agreements that we have in place to initiate these discussions. I think when you see the valsartan example was a very good one, because there was a small group of folks that were talking to each other and saying we could do this, right? And it grew from there and went up as opposed to down from the top. And so I think the motivation is there for it. It's just a matter of getting the people to work together and pushing it through most of the time.
And I mean, I'll just echo what what David said. I mean, a lot of that is about kind of processes, about structure. With some of these things, when we've come together for some of these big projects, also, it's because it's an area that is very much of mutual interest for us. And so I think those are areas that we want to continue to identify in the future where we all want to work together on this. And we've been having conversations with our EMA counterparts, Darwin EU, watching through the implementation. What can we do moving forward so that we can all continue to work together and build on these good partnerships so that we can continue to investigate these areas of mutual interest? COVID proved a lot of what we can do. A lot of the past, queries that have been done between CNODES and Sentinel have proved what we can do. But I think we all recognize we can do a lot more, and we can do it more strategically.
Hi, thank you very much for all these presentations. I'm Ariel Arias. I'm right now a professor associate at l'Université de Montréal, but I'm also a retired Health Canada person. So I was there when the DSEN started, and actually when the mini Sentinel started, and then the Sentinel and all these things. And my question is about the philosophy of this. I mean, the philosophy. I pay a lot of attention to the databases that you were mentioning there, and I didn't see any of the pharmacovigilance databases from Health Canada or from the FDA. There is no errors, there is no Canada vigilance there. Is that because the collaboration aims to continue doing what they were doing at the very beginning? It is just having the question popping up through these pharmacovigilance databases and then send it to the databases, to the other databases to actually respond to these queries that was the beginning? Or is there any other way to do things and actually try to implement somehow these pharmacovigilance databases and just get in the question and right away start working? I mean, I didn't see that, and I'm just curious about it. And then for the follow-ups, it's the same thing. I mean, sometimes you get the report, the notification of the adverse drug reaction, and is the expectation to have these reports popping up somehow through the electronic health record somehow? Maybe some of them are gonna popping up there, but not all of them. So these are questions that I have for you guys, and what are you thinking about all this? Thank you.
I can take perhaps a little bit of that, and I have to be very cautious of my pharmacovigilance person who is in the audience today. But combining, FDA's FAIRs with Sentinel would be, I think, a huge lift and probably not feasible. But we are moving towards having a pharmacovigilance approach implemented into Sentinel. And so using these non-hypothesis testing approaches, such as tree scan, where you don't have a presupposed safety signal that you're looking for, you're just looking to see if you have a concern. Like that pharmacovigilance approach is now being implemented in these large databases under a common data model. And I think it holds great promise to like advancing the pharmacovigilance side. And then we need to think about it, the whole thing on a continuum, right? As you build evidence, you get a better understanding of the safety concern, and that builds evidence for regulation or for actions to prevent harm or protect public health. And so I don't look at them as mutually exclusive. I look at them as reinforcing in the same way the collaborations with us.
Yeah, and I would say I would agree with that. I mean, it would be interesting to see if we could combine these in the future, noting that it would be a big lift, as David said, if we added the CBP, say, in with, the data that CNODES obtains. But I think right now, a lot of what we do is we look at that initial signal, and then we go, for example, to the Common Data Model to explore, okay, what does this mean versus, say, incorporating that CBP data in there, at least in the Canadian context.
And I think also just the issues of, in terms of the databases, in terms of what's captured, what's the denominator, and at least from a CNODES perspective, one of the reasons we're often doing these multi-database studies is because there's a sample size needed, and if given that FAIRS is already a single database, it's I don't want to say already a one-stop shop for pharmacovigilance. Yeah. Ingrid.
Ingrid Sketchus from Halifax, Nova Scotia. I enjoyed the presentations. And I have a question for you as to, once you have done the study, how do you best see from the Canadian and the American perspective to get the information to prescribers?
So, actually, sorry. In terms of dissemination, so all of the results are first going back to the original requesters. So in this case, they're going to go back to FDA, Health Canada, and CADTH. And then from there, those results are going to be synthesized. And then at some point, we have processes for which we clear and then post onto our website whatever's been created, in addition to the programs that actually created those. So the code and the results. In terms of the results dissemination beyond the website, so like sort of a focused, sort of dissemination, I think honestly, I guess I'll turn it over to these guys. It's really up to the individuals to think about if they wanted to do anything more. I mean, we do things like, for example, you'll see many presentations at the conference, this week with respect to some of the results that are being published. There's, manuscripts, but I think each of the different particular questions, you may have different audiences that you need to disseminate to. And so each time you do it there's a common transparency initiative to just post, but then for a targeted sort of dissemination, it's probably going to be question dependent and based on the needs of the asker.
Just maybe add to what Judy said. Everything she said is bang on, and I agree 100%. And I think the tail end of that would be, as she said, once it comes to CADTH, so when things have been published and on all of our represented websites, the question is who needs it and how do they need it to be used, right? And so it's a custom tailoring. It's something that CADTH really has been doing for many years, and we have a knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization team that does that. We have somebody embedded on our team exclusively just to deal with this, because we're not only dealing with the policymakers, but we're dealing with clinicians, we're dealing with patients, other groups as well. So we want to make sure that the pieces that we produce are digested and understandable by that particular group. So whether it's changing prescribing behavior or whether it's a tool to help you navigate the system or an algorithm, those are all things that I think we're all committed to do once we've done the work.
And one point that I want to make in terms of these research studies that we request that are delivered to us, oftentimes, and I think more often than not, they're just one piece of the evidence. So as regulators, we need to consider this in the context of many other different pieces of evidence that we have. So it really is, and I hate to say this because it's such an RWE thing to say, it's on a case-by-case basis in terms of how much it actually contributes to our decision-making. And so, yeah, it's one piece of the puzzle for us as regulators.
Hi, I'm Madeline Gazarian from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. And my question picks up on Ingrid's point and links into a point I really liked that was in the last speaker in terms of the creating better connections between those who are in decision-making roles and those who are in positions to generate the evidence. And on that note, the decision makers that are closer to the clinical interface, whether it be prescribers or hospital drug committee decision makers or payers, the sorts of evidence that additional sort of pieces of information that they need include comparative effectiveness safety data and cost effectiveness data. So my question is in terms of the collaboration that you described and its capacity either now or in the near future to be able to generate, not only generate that kind of data, but to have that linkage operate in a kind of more real-time way.
Thanks for your question. It's a great point. And so unfortunately with today's presentation, I only was able to present the CDM component of the work that our CoLab is trying to do. But another much larger piece is actually looking at cost effectiveness and comparative analyses between molecules or standards of care for new molecules coming, utilization. So the ability to look at more than just safety signals. So we're looking at safety and effectiveness in the post-market space, and we are trying to do that in a way where we're serving specific questions from the decision maker, whether it's those, like you said, managing a hospital formulary or those that are managing provincial formulary. The idea, again, is to give them what they need to answer those questions. Now, more broadly at CADTH, I should say, I'm kind of obviously very biased because I'm talking about my program and our network, but we sit within a large organization, and our organization actually does a lot of other pieces as well. And so we look at reimbursement review, we do other HTA work, formulary management, we have a full health economics team. The idea being we're a full shop. And so if there is a need by a particular group outside of what we do in CoLab and PMDE, they have that ability to come to CADTH and get that type of service. So so we're multi-layered. I'm just showcasing my floor on the shopping mall, but there are other stores in the mall as well. So yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect. So I guess while waiting for other potential questions from the audience, I guess I have a question. And just, I guess, many times the needs of the regulator, the HTA body, health policymaker or payer, and also participating academic researchers as it relates to post-marketing evaluations differ. So how do we reconcile these differing needs and to facilitate the collaboration between all these groups?
Maybe I'll take a first stab at that one, unless anybody else wants it. Nobody? No takers? Okay. Thanks for the question, Chris. I think what we saw today is that there are different players in the game as it comes to co-production, each with different needs. And then your question is saying they all have different needs. So how are we going to do this? And I think if we could flip it, we could say, despite the differences, there are a lot of similarities and there's a lot of mutually beneficial things that we're trying to get out of this. I think the end goal is the same, which is to get good evidence to answer the question in front of us. I think for most times that central question would be the same for all groups. However, each respective group will have some other sub questions. So the regulators sometimes ask for different things versus the HTA body versus the policymaker. But I think the goal is to set it up so that you have the data you need to ask the central questions, but you also have that data to answer sub questions. And you do that in a co-produced way where you're all agreeing to the terms of engagement and you have that process in place. I think that allows you to overcome some of the differences of the different constituents.
Yeah, Chris, I guess we've presented before in this forum several years ago about some of our collaborations within federal agencies. So in the US, FDA has collaborated with CDC, for example, to ask particular questions. They did a lot of work on Lyme disease and prophylaxis for Lyme disease. And that's an example of using the network in order to answer questions. Now we're starting to get into like branching out into, could we do that on an international basis, the equivalent of the, Canadian equivalent of the US CDC, would there be interest in something, Lyme disease happens in Canada too, we are vacationing here before this meeting. And so, it's something that, you could see there are pathways to do it, but there's a lot of players and it requires a lot of groundwork to be laid. And Dave made a point earlier, we're right now leveraging and taking advantage of a lot of pre-existing memorandums of understanding across countries for different functions to talk to each other. But even within those functions, it's not always clear that everybody's allowed to share all of this information all at the same time. So working through all those processes is, if we could just get a, equivalent of the Ministry of Health and the Health and Human Services to all work together, we'd have a great massive network, but it will require a lot.
Perfect. Go back to the mic here.
Hey, Andrew Basham, Brigham Hospital again. I was just wondering, I did used to work at MCHP, so I know a bit about, there was this thing, the National Data Platform that was being proffered a while ago. And I'm wondering within Canada, like I know CNODES is there. So I was just wondering if that if there's any relation with that or, and also I was just curious about if there have been thoughts about doing like a synthetic data development to combine these at an individual level, like if between countries, like you could do synthetic data from each province and then the Sentinel and then combine them, if there's any thought about that in the future.
So I don't know if I can answer the second one. In terms of kind of having a common data platform, like it's something that we have thought of over time, of course, but the big challenge in Canada, as Chris pointed out before, we have the data is owned by the provinces and territories. So this is what makes it very challenging for us because, you have access to different types of data, different timeliness. And when the data is coming in, there's, heterogeneity, some small cells. We have a lot of issues to deal with that, but that would be like that would be the Cadillac model that we would love at some point in the future.
Well, and I guess just to give you an idea, just like a basic example of, how things are different. Okay, so like the Ontario data are, drugs covered by the provincial plan, which is 65 and above plus social assistance. The British Columbia data are all drug dispensings regardless of payer across the age span. So just when we're talking about the different, and those are just two examples from two of our larger provinces, but just when you're talking about, the differences in the data, they're very real. And, when you're trying to, one of the reasons it's so important to look at data overall and by jurisdiction is when you're, just looking at some, differences in rates, does it make sense? Well, let's, look at those descriptives to make sure. And is the heterogeneity real, and is it consistent with what you'd expect based on the data capture and the question being asked? In terms of your second part, it's a really interesting idea. I think it underscores a lot of the success between Sentinel and CNODES has been built based on important investments in infrastructure and methods development. And as we move on, and I think it's going to be important to continue to invest in that methods development so that we can continue to drive and implement best practices. Mina.
Thank you. Thanks for a great panel. And so I'm Mina Tadros. I'm from the University of Toronto. You guys are going to get a lot of questions, right? And I'm sure there's a lot of queries that come in and a lot of interesting things. And as CoLab spreads its wings more and gets more people into the nest, they're going to ask a lot of different questions. And as you want to work together, how are you thinking about prioritization? How do you, I'm just curious, between the US and Canada, what factors go into prioritizing? Is it prevalence? Is it I would just love to know some of the thinking and how you're thinking through when you have a lot of queries and you only have certain resources, how you're going to tackle them. Thank you.
The P word.
So maybe I can start, because I am not responsible for the prioritization decisions. But there are certain queries that I think, again, if you think of, I always think of this as like the complementary strengths, right? So if I need to do rare diseases, I want the biggest population I can possibly have. And that's gained by looking at these things together. If I'm looking for monitoring something where I need 10 years of follow-up, then that's a good candidate for thinking about, okay, definitely we need to do this in this international way. So I think part of it is taking the individual concerns that come up and starting to look at and say, do I have a comparative advantage here? Is it a better use of resources to do this on this international basis versus just do it, individually in the national systems? But then they make the decision.
And I think, as I'm thinking about, wait, first of all, Mina, thanks for a nice softball question with 5 minutes to go, right? But I also think that, as we're thinking about the needs of various people involved in prioritization, we can also, think about ways of, more rapid study for signal generation, followed by a more definitive study that'll take longer if it's needed. And first one might be CDM, second one might be a specifically developed protocol, kind of like what we've done in some of our studies. But part of the prioritization, I think, might involve trying to do that quick signal generation. Is it something where it's sufficiently high, the signal is sufficiently high priority that it's worth spending that year for a full-on multi-jurisdictional study on it. Any other questions from the audience? No. Going what? I know it's like 2 minutes to 5. Everyone's like happy hour somewhere. With that, I just want to thank our panel for a great discussion and for everyone for joining us today. Thank you.